Hi, TG Wolff here, and I am the author of today's story. Can we start over? I should.
Nope.
Come on.
Nope. Hi, TG Wolff here.
Who should have wrote a script to say that I'm the author of today, and rather than doing anything else, support the authors who write for us this season. Check them out on our website, tgwolff.com/podcast. Check out their episodes and their backstories, and hang around for a story or two. They're great storytellers.
Don't you have a book coming out soon, or that came out recently?
We had a book come out in September.
Oh, well, you're an author in that book, so you can promote it in this slot.
Check out Games People Play, Final Moves.
It's for this podcast. Check out, what was it again?
What was it again? Oh my goodness. Are you sure you're not going to let me redo this?
No, this is great.
This is horrible.
Great. So,
can you just play the introduction, please?
No. We're still going. So Games People Play, and then,
Final Move.
Final Move.
And it is episodes 13 through 24. So It starts with Twister by Jason Little, and it ends with Rock, Scissors, Paper, Shoot by Jack Wolff.
Then I really reorganized Rock, Scissors, Paper, Shoot.
Rock, paper, scissors.
You just said rock, scissors, paper.
Everybody knows what the game is.
Okay.
Can you just play the intro music?
It's a simple game.
Oh my goodness.
Did I start too high?
Welcome to Mysteries to Die For. I am TG Wolff, and I'm here with Jack, my piano player and really stubborn producer. This is a podcast where we combine storytelling with original music to put you at the heart of a mystery. All of our stories are structured to challenge you to beat the detectives to the solution. These are arrangements, which means no matter what is written on a page, you get whatever comes out of my mouth. Jack and I perform these live, as he just proved, front to back, no breaks, no fakes, no retakes. This is Season 7, Games People Play. Games are about competition conducted according to rules, with participants working toward a goal. Games are a part of every culture and are one of the oldest forms of social interaction and engagement. Games can be fun, challenging, and exhilarating. They can also be intense, cutthroat, and lethal. This season, our authors have fashioned deadly games and unscrupulous villains to test your detection skills. This is episode 23. Hangman is the featured game. This is The Hangman's Ladies by TG Wolff.
Yay, I am so excited. So, it was a rough start. I think we can all agree.
It was a rough start. It was an entertaining start.
It was good. So let's pick a sound effect for today. I'm thinking an electric piano sound effect.
No, because this is an oldie time one. This is like 1890.
So you're telling me I can break out the honky tonk?
I don't know what honky tonk sounds like.
A honky tonk?
1890, not 9. This sounds like ragtime, so yeah, it would fit.
Yeah, honky tonk. There's honky tonk 1, honky tonk 2.
Yeah, ragtime.
I don't know ragtime, unfortunately. I don't know any ragtimes.
Just rag. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not Billy Joel or the guy who wrote The Entertainer. Well, Billy Joel also wrote
Scott Joplin.
Both entertainers.
Both entertainers.
I'm gonna shut up. Let's get into it.
This is gonna be a fun one, people. Fun one. P is for pain, pain, and pain. I urged my mount forward, nimbly weaving through the traffic on Cleveland streets. The wind off Lake Erie and the speed of the ride had ripped my hat from my head several streets ago. It trailed behind me, the knot from the ties pressing into my throat. The crisp October air, grateful as I was for it, did little to cool the heat that drove me. What in the grouse shout of a delivery driver acknowledged my agile navigation through the intersection. Crazy woman, driver! I glanced back to see his horses rearing. Sorry, it's an emergency. people and horses blurred. Tears filled my eyes. A swipe of my sleeve vanquished them, and I pressed the horse on harder. Not nearly soon enough. The dark, lurking facade of the Cleveland Police Headquarters rose in the distance. Normally, I would turn to my brother, Patrolman Grant McPherson, for help in matters such as this one. Grant was brilliant, and one I trusted to no end, but he had been sent to Columbus to train with their detective squad for the entire month. That left me with only one choice. I pulled back on the reins and dismounted without a thought. My feet protested the landing, but I ignored them and tied the horse to a post. Skirts in hand, I raced up the stairs and through the oversized doors. I marched up to the tall pulpit where a sergeant ruled over the floor. "Detective Kean Kelly, if you please." The bulbous man peered down from his perch. "What's with all the noise, you filthy urchin?" "Oh, the insult! I'm a lady, and I need Detective Kelly now." He looked me over head to toe. "O'Reilly, escort this lady out. I've got no time for hysterics." A patrolman with a wax mustache left his conversation, a determined set to his mouth. "Come on now, you. Out with you." "Don't touch me," I hissed. I whipped away before O'Reilly could react and shouted up the staircase. "Detective Kelly! Detective Kean Kelly! Kean Kelly! Kean Kelly!" The sergeant leaned down from his lofty barrier. "Now see here. What's with all the shouting?" Detective Kelly's voice came from the staircase. He was invisible until he rounded the landing. He was, as I remembered, broad-shouldered with narrow hips, covered in a well-fitted suit that must have been a challenge for his tailor. His thick blonde hair was worn in the current fashion, which framed his bright blue eyes and the unhappy set to his lips. "Miss McPherson, what brings you? You're filthy." With that observation, he hurried down the last flight of steps. "McPherson," O'Reilly repeated, cocking his head. "Grant's sister?" I lifted my chin and gave a short nod. "Well, he's told us stories about you," O'Reilly said, backing away. "I'll leave you to Detective Kelly." "Oh, the insult! Again! If you—" Kelly cut me off, herding me to a corner. "Payne, are you hurt? What happened?" "Professor Riley is dead." My voice cracked. I'm not a stranger to death or to dead bodies, but finding my dear teacher that way, well, this was different. "Kean, it was murder." "Start at the beginning." He squeezed my arm, encouraging in a soft voice. "Can you do that?" Needing an anchor, I took his hand and clutched it, pressing it to my stomach. "I went to her house at 1:30 and found her hanging from her French door. I left immediately to get you." Calm, facts, information. That's what would help Elizabeth Riley. "You're doing good, Payne. Now, are you certain she was dead?" I nodded as I took a deep breath. I checked for a pulse and breath. She had neither. Tears wanted to fall, but that was for later. Instead, I looked into Kelly's eyes. She wouldn't have killed herself. Not then. Our study group was to meet at her house at 2. She just reminded us all of it yesterday. Kelly furrowed his brows. "Did you leave it unlocked?" "I had to," I said, perhaps defensively. "I didn't have the key, but I stopped by my father's house. He and Uncle Alistair said they'd go over to keep the others out until you got there." He huffed with annoyance. "That pair will keep everyone out but themselves." I shook my head. "I told them not to go in, that I was going directly to fetch you." He bent down until he looked me in the eyes. And when has a McPherson ever done what they're told? From some impossible depth, a giggle bubbled up. "I see your point. What kind of person laughs at a time like this?" I stepped back, taking his hand with me. "We should hurry." "We will." He started pulling me down a back hallway. "Is there something else I need to know?" "No?" Fire lit my cheeks. "I, may have borrowed a horse without permission." He stopped abruptly, causing me to run into him. "You stole a horse?" "McPherson's." He said our name like a curse. "Let's go." Kelly drove the horse and wagon signed out from the Cleveland police pool. I rode beside him, my hat back on my head with most of my hair tucked up. I worked on my face using a kerchief. Without a mirror, soap, and water, I doubt I had transformed from the urchin back to a lady. The borrowed horse was tied to the back of the wagon and went along agreeably as we plodded up Euclid Avenue. "Tell me about Miss Riley. How do you know her?" Kelly asked. "Was she distressed? In trouble?" "Professor Elizabeth Riley is an instructor at Mather College. She's a celebrated horticulturalist." "Oh, detectives. She's written books and traveled the world." I detailed some of her more interesting exploits. She was incredible. I had some idea of, following in her footsteps. At least I used to. "I thought we agreed that you would call me Kian." He made a left turn that took us into my neighborhood. "What do you mean you used to want to follow her?" How was I to explain that the man who saw me as his assistant's younger sister, I wanted more than just an intellectual life? Possibly with him. I'm still interested in horticulture, but with the concentration of pharmacology. More, I'm realizing that Cleveland may just offer me everything I need for a career. I looked up at him. And a family. His frown deepened. He quickly looked away as he swallowed once and then again. I see. It appears we are here." Our destination had a porch filled with educated and vocal women being kept at bay by one stubborn engineer, my uncle, Alistair McPherson. "Your father is noticeably absent," Kian said as he brought the wagon to the curb. "Oh, I'm sure he hasn't returned home," I retorted, protective of my father's integrity. "I, too, am sure he hasn't returned home." Kian climbed down and went around to help me, though I didn't need it. Together, we climbed the stairs to where Uncle Alistair blocked the front door. "Payne, what has happened to Professor Riley?" Edna asked as Mary Margaret said, "Why won't anyone tell us anything?" Detective Kelly, Kian, held out his hands like some biblical figure calming a cantankerous sea. "There's been an incident involving Professor Riley. I'm Detective Kelly, Cleveland Police, and I'm here to investigate. I will tell you what I can, when I can, and not a minute sooner. It would be better for everyone if you return to your homes." "Then how are you going to tell us what you learn?" the quiet Dolly asked. "We can meet this evening at my house," I interjected to quell the rise. 5 o'clock. Detective Kelly shall inform us all on the strange happenings of the day." Well, the crowd was not appreciative of my idea. Mutterings and mumblings of discontent were a rumbling thunder. "That's as good as it's going to get." Kian crossed his arms, his face set in hard, unwavering lines. "Be off with you." Dolly went first. The rest followed begrudgingly. It was then that Kian turned to Uncle Alistair. "All right, take me to the body." "Elizabeth," I said, following the pair inside. "Her name is Elizabeth Riley." I had been in her house no less than a dozen times as she hosted a weekly study group for her students. I admired her home. It was only a few years old. It was bright and airy. Shelves jutted out from under the windows, covered with potted plants that gave the room the feel of a jungle. The furnishings themselves were simple, but ample, befitting a hostess who entertained a bevy of female students weekly. French doors made of 24 glass panes separated the front room from the dining room. That's where my head spun. "Easy, lass," Kian said softly in my ear. "She's beyond the pain." S is for stick figure. Professor Elizabeth Riley was 32 years old. While she never married, she was far from the spinster one usually thinks of at that age. She was the author of several monoliths on plants under the name E.E. Riley. Currently, her 5'5" body hung suspended by a green rope rigged over the door and secured somewhere behind. The rope was knotted around her neck and her head listed to one side. Her blonde hair draped forward, hiding most of her face, and the toes of her slippered feet floated an inch off the floor. My father, Dr. Ewan McPherson, was the finest surgeon Scotland ever turned out. He gently ran his hands through her hair. Kian circled my father, studying the rope, the door, the body. Then he planted his hands on his hips. "'Tis murder we have." "Agreed," my father said. "She died recently, less than an hour ago. There's no other damage to her person. No blows to the head, no signs of poisoning. But this is interesting." He lifted her hand. "She clawed someone or something hard enough to break her fingernails." "Let's get her down." Kian swept an arm under her knees, taking her weight and allowing father to remove the noose from around her neck. He glanced at me as they laid her on the hardwood floor. I knelt across from my father, the position I often take while assisting him in his work. He nodded and then shared his assessment. "It appears she died from a broken neck. All the telltale markers are here. I would need to perform an autopsy to confirm no other factors played a role. There are no signs of poison, but if it was designed to muddle instead of kill, it might not be apparent." "How do you know it wasn't suicide?" I asked. "I mean, I know she didn't kill herself, but how do you know?" "She couldn't get herself into that position alone. It would take a stool or a chair that would then be kicked away. There's nothing she could have stood on." Kian let the length run across his bare hand. "This isn't standard grade. It's silk, more like is used for drapery. One end was tied into a slip knot positioned at the back of her neck. The rope went over top the door, and the other end wound around the door handle. She fought, tried to kick out the glass, but only succeeded in cracking one." Kian lifted his chin to point to behind me. I turned and noticed the coffee table for the first time. It was low, square, and made of a nearly black wood. It was a wonderful table that could comfortably hold 12 china cups and trays of sandwiches and sweets without a care. Now it held 2 plates, each with a few crumbles. A serving plate held 2 sandwiches without crusts and cut into triangles. A glass with a pale yellow liquid sat next to each plate. One was nearly empty, the other barely touched. Between the 2 settings, in the corner of the table, were several sheets of paper and a pencil. "It appears that she was playing a game," I said. "Never seen anything like it." Most of the paper was filled with a simple drawing of a gallows and a stick figure man being hung. Toward the bottom were 6 lines, and some lines had letters above them, while a list of 6 letters were written below. It appeared like this: underscore, underscore with an S, and then underscore, 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 and then underscore with an E. The letters listed below were A, I, O, U, T, and R. "It's called Hangman," Kian said. "You have to guess what the word is 1 letter at a time. Every time you're wrong, a body part is drawn. Head, body, arms, legs. 6 wrong answers, and you're hung." "How macabre," Father said with interest as he sifted through the discarded pages. They played the game several times. Goddess, Dandelion, Artemis, Pachysandra. "The 4th and 2nd one are in Elizabeth's handwritings," I said. "The words themselves give her away, too." Kian examined the lost game. "I wonder what the word was. More importantly, I wonder how she went from sitting on her couch sipping lemonade to hanging from her door." Miss McPherson, please sit where Professor Riley would have been positioned." I took the short couch, which put my back to the French doors. "This was her seat," I said, "when we would meet. People don't change habits, so here I am, eating my lunch, drinking my lemonade." I dropped my hand to the couch cushion and felt something hard. I found a fingernail. Kian came up behind me and, unexpectedly, wrapped his hands around my throat. I jumped and followed his loose but insistent grip around the couch toward the dining room. Walking backwards, there was little I could do but grab his wrist and scratch his forearms. Then he let me go. That's how it was done, I would guess. There was nothing Professor Riley could use to stop her assailant. Uncle Alistair pinched his chin. "Very likely. Nothing is upset in any of the rooms. She was taken by surprise and overpowered. But the fiend did not get away clean. I expect we can find finger marks on the glass and possibly on the French door. I would be happy to run home to get my film and my camera. We all turned as the body wagon pulled up out front. The help is appreciated, Mr. McPherson. Kean turned to me. Go home, Miss McPherson. I'll come by soon, he said, and then hastily added, I have some questions about Miss Riley. Well, that's the first two sections with not much of a mishap. Hopefully we got those out of our system.
Look, are you telling me this woman, poor woman, sat down at a murder scene and Detective Hot Stuff sat down next to her and was like, you know what I'm going to do right now? Grab and just strangles her, fake
Strangles.
But still, you gotta warn a woman. I mean, I guess it was the 1800s, but jeez.
You gotta warn a woman before you fake strangle her.
My gosh.
Jack's rule of mysteries. Number 1. If you're gonna fake strangle somebody, warn them.
Yeah, I mean, that's intense, man. I was just listening like, oh, okay, it got weird fast.
This is kind of, a family that's into murder.
Apparently, McPherson, it sounds familiar.
Yeah, this is the second time I think I've story told with them. Maybe the third. Okay.
There's a lot of names that end up sounding familiar, like Allegra. I'll never forget that name.
Yeah, no, I didn't create Allegra. I created
one character,
Pain.
like 3 seasons ago, was named Allegra, and I can't get over it.
And so many episodes, you can't remember any of the character names.
Even at the end of them, I'm calling them the wrong name. I will never forget Allegra. Okay, all you have to do
is name characters Allegra.
Name characters after something is so outstandishly. Why did you name them that? I won't forget. Bob, I won't remember Bob. Okay. Michael's out the door. Okay, in one ear, out the other.
What if you pronounced it Michelle?
Well, here's the thing. I don't have a script in front of me. I would just imagine it's spelled Michelle.
So you would forget it.
Yeah, it's still Michelle. It's not. I don't care if it's French. Anywho. All right, let's see who hanged the man. Well, whoa, man.
All right, you ready for Y is for yellow-bellied sapsucker?
Sure, let's go for it.
A low fire kept our parlor comfortable as 8 of my fellow students from Elizabeth Riley's advanced horticulture class sat stock straight while Kean spoke. Thank you for your cooperation at Miss Riley's home, he said as an opening, one I suggested he used to earn their respect. In difficult times, we all want answers, but we want correct answers. Speculation and rumors, even done in earnest, can delay outcomes. I regret to inform you that Professor Elizabeth Riley died this afternoon in her home. She was murdered. Of course, his announcement set the room a tither. Some gasped, some sat in shock, some rose to their feet in denial. How did she die? Esther asked. We have a right to know. She was hung, Kean answered, as gently as he could. It was made to look as if she suicided. Thanks to Miss McPherson and her family, the facts showed through the staging. Not another hanging, Mary Margaret said, kerchief pressed to her cheeks. Kean looked to me, but I had no answer. Another? He prompted. Mary Margaret nodded sadly. One of the nurses in my rooming house hung herself from the rafters last week. Eric Mulrooney. It made no sense. Erin was to leave the next morning to stay with her sister until she gave birth. It was all she talked about. Kean took his notepad from the inside of his suit coat. Miss Mulrooney was single? Mrs. Mulrooney. She was in her mid-30s, widowed, she said. Erin became a nurse after her husband died from tuberculosis. She was beautiful and smart and frequently enjoyed the company of male callers. Mrs. Howard allowed visitors in the house. As she's fond of saying, she's not our mother or our priest. Kean wrote the information, asking questions until he exhausted Mary Margaret's knowledge. It didn't take long. Does anyone know of any other hangings? His gaze landed on Dolly, the quietest of us all, who was looking more uncomfortable than usual. Possibly? She shrank back into her chair. There was a woman who worked in a ladies' clothing store on Mayfield Road in Little Italy, Leona Petrucci. She had the loveliest hats, and I heard she was found hung in the back room of her shop. There was talk of a man. Her father didn't approve. He wasn't Roman. Do you know her age? Kian asked. Was she a young woman or older, like Miss Riley and Mrs. Mulrooney? Oh, she was also in her 30s, Dolly said. Like Mrs. Mulrooney, she was widowed, but she had a daughter. Diana surged to her feet. Some maniac is out there killing single women. Kian rose much more slowly. We don't know that. Remember, we are not jumping to conclusions. Hands on her hips, Diana leaned toward him. 3 women have all been hung, all of them called suicides. It's not just murder, it's a conspiracy. The others began to nod and whisper, and I jumped to my feet. We need information, not hysterics. Go home, talk to your neighbors, to your friends, find out if any other women have died or it has been called suicide. Together, we can quickly get the information Detective Kelly and the Cleveland police need to determine if there is a Hangman Ripper out there or not. I turned to Kian. What information do you need from us? And Kian hesitated for a moment. I was afraid he was going to tell us all to go home and not to worry our pretty little heads. Instead, he showed himself to be a man of intelligence. I need names and addresses. It would be helpful to have the same for someone close to them. Family, friends, landlord. Of course, I'm interested in the men that they may have been seeing. Dolly slowly raised a hand. Kian acknowledged her. Yes, miss, you have a question? Well, Professor Riley enjoyed the company of men. She spoke softly, and we all had to be silent in order to hear her. One was a doctor, DuPont. She broke off with him recently and was seeing someone else, an artist. She didn't say his name. Kian wrote quickly. More questions were asked, but nothing else was learned. When it was obvious that the inquiries had run their course, I cleared my throat and rose. You can bring any information you have to me, and I'll get it to Detective Kelly directly. Together, we will find the yellow-bellied sapsucker who killed Professor Riley and hold him accountable. My friends rose in unison, planning on vengeance by building on my metaphors as they filed out our door. All lived in the neighborhood and would be behind doors before nightfall. Kian practically pinned me to the door. What, pray tell, is a yellow-bellied sapsucker? It's a type of woodpecker, I said, trying to sound a calm I didn't feel. A true nuisance who can topple an entire tree and should be shot on sight. Kian's stone facade cracked and he smiled. Bloodthirsty vixen, aren't you? Have we our house back?
These are some red flags, buddy. Okay, it's been weird. These are some red flags, okay? And you wrote this. He's not real. This is some red flags coming out of you right here. That's what's happening. I'm learning more about Mom, and I don't like it.
I don't remember writing this.
That's the worst part. It just so consciously came out, and then he pinned her. Okay. Oh, jeez, man.
I did. I'd really like, oh, that's interesting.
All right, let's keep going. I figured I needed to...
You need to call me out on that,
I needed to know that this wasn't natural. Not natural. This wasn't normal.
Normal? It's not like they just met.
Still, they know each other. They're buddies, and they're like, hey, let me...
They're flirting.
Okay, she's flirting. It didn't seem like he was flirting.
He just wanted to know what a yellow-bellied sapsucker was.
Yeah, but he seemed very hesitant. I'm going to shut up. I stopped in the middle of a paragraph.
Have we our house back? Uncle Alistair called from his third-floor landing. Can we have dinner now? We do have our house back, I said, pushing Kian's arms away. It smells like Miss Ventrello will have it on the table soon. I'll check. Who is Miss Ventrello? Kian asked, following me toward the kitchen. A poor widow whose husband died in a construction accident. Her family is in Italy, and his family turned her out. So my father offered her a job here. She's a wonderful cook. I pushed open the kitchen door and we were greeted by the scent of seasoned meat and fresh bread. Kian's stomach growled. Laughing, I said to Mrs. Ventrello, "My guests are gone. How much longer until dinner is ready? Uncle Alistair is asking." "Oh, that Alistair," she said in her thick accent. She wore a black dress, a sign of mourning. Her dark brown hair was bound in a long braid that swayed as she worked. "Always with the food. Tell him to finish his maniac experiment and then we'll eat." She turned away from the stove, her large belly in profile, a brilliant smile on her face. "Who is your gentleman?" "My gentleman." I made the introduction. "Mrs. Maria Ventrello, this is Detective Kian Kelly of the Cleveland Police. He's Grant's supervisor." "Mrs. Ventrello," Kian said with a small bow. "A pleasure to meet you. Maria. Please to everyone to call me Maria. You eat with us, yes, Detective?" "He eats with us, yes. Kian will help me set the table." I went to the cabinet and filled his hands with 5 settings. "You should have mentioned she was pregnant," he said into my ear. I opened the drawer for silverware. "What difference does that make?" Dinner was stewed pork with a side of murder. Father sat at the head of the table. Kian and I sat on one side, Uncle Alistair and Maria on the other. "I knew Leona Petrucci," Maria said with a slow shake of her head. "We were friends, 2 widows. She had her daughter, Clara, and her father. He is a tailor and opened the second shop for her, for ladies, for Leona. Oh, she had an eye for style, and many peoples come from all over Cleveland. Her father, he found her in the small parlor with the stairs that went up to the apartment where she lived in with Clara. She hung herself from the railing with the yellow silk rope. An odd choice." Kian tore into a third roll in half. "How is it an odd choice?" "Because there was silk everywhere," Maria explained. "Bolts and bolts of silk and cotton and all the materials. It would have been easy to fashion a noose from material, but the silk of the rope was not from the shop." She sighed. "The people say she never accepted her husband's death, but it was not true. Leona was very happy when her year was over. She made a soft blue dress, like an eggshell. No more black for Leona. She found a new man. Her papa, oh, he no like this new man." "No surprise," my father said. "I suppose no father likes the man his daughter chooses." He looked at me. "We all want you to stay small and sweet and devoted to us." I laughed at his outrageous comment. I was never sweet. How could I be when I was doing autopsies on frog by the time I was 7? I turned to Maria. "Was there a reason, like a real reason, her father didn't like the new man?" She rolled her eyes and her hand in a way that said nothing and everything at the same time. "Did she mention a name?" Kian asked. "Andreas Pappas." She lifted her wine glass, swirling it as she thought. "He works as a professor at the university. He teach the Greek classics and write the poetry." Kian rested his hand on my forearm. He glanced at me, an expression that wanted me to stay quiet. "Did there happen to be any papers in the room? Were Leona and this professor playing a game?" Maria paled, her hand shook. Uncle Alistair caught her wine glass before she spilled it. "Yes, the children, they play it. Boya. What is the English? A hangman, yes." The 4 of us exchanged knowing glances. Of course, Maria noticed. "Does this mean something, this game?"
And we have the killer. That was quick. Thanks for watching, guys. Come back next week for a toe tag.
We only got like a few letters out. We got P, S, and Y. Now we got to go into C is for CAD.
PSYC. Wonder what that spells. Add an HO and you have Vince Vaughn. All right, let's keep it going.
I was very annoyed with Detective Kian Kelly. The cad refused to let me to come with him to hear what the other detective had learned in the case of Leona Petrucci and Aaron Mulrooney. Well, he left me no choice but to investigate myself, which was what brought me to Professor Riley's office at Mather College. A diligent woman, her desk and bookshelves were neatly ordered, while the windowsills overflowed with plants. This made it especially easy to find the second key to her house, which went into my pocket, and her calendar. Each day she noted her class times, office hours, study sessions, and private appointments. She had blacked out yesterday from noon to 2 using a large X, but with no indication of what was to happen in that time. This was opposed to the time between 2 and 4 o'clock, which had a thinner X with the words study group next to it. Why the secrecy in her own calendar? I came up with 2 reasons. 1, it was something or someone who would cause a scandal. 2, though it was her calendar, she must have reasonably expected others to see it. After all, she wouldn't need to hide a secret from herself. I paged backwards slowly, scanning all the entries for names that were either male or the suspicious X. I found 4 X's going back a few weeks. 2 Sundays, 1 Tuesday, and yesterday, Wednesday. I went through her desk drawers looking for letters to give some clue to X. The small collection in the bottom drawer were from colleagues and largely centered on plants. I would have to return to her home to check for personal letters. The door opened, and a handsome and athletic man came in. "Say, what are you doing at Professor Riley's desk?" There was a nasty tone to his voice that matched the snarl of his lips. I rose and squared my shoulders. "Miss Pay McPherson, I'm supporting the Cleveland Police's investigation into her death." "You are?" "Dr. Michael DuPont," he snapped, "if it's any of your business." "Please, sit down," I said. Though suspicious, he obeyed, but not silently. Since when do they allow women to investigate suicides? I thought, what would Kean do, and proceeded to ignore the uninformed jibe, going for information instead. "When did you last see Miss Riley?" "Yesterday morning." He wore anger as surely as he wore a suit. "I'm her doctor. She came to consult with me, about a trip she planned to take. She was interested in the developments in the prevention of malaria. She left my office just before the strike of 11 in the morning." He was lying. Through his teeth. To my face. Professor Riley was not planning a trip. In fact, the expedition she had been planning had been canceled due to lack of funding. She talked of fundraising to go next spring. But DuPont had seen Miss Riley only an hour before her luncheon. Interesting. "Did you see her later in the day?" He shook his head. "I invited her to join me last evening for a gallery opening at the Art Institute. She indicated her interest, but killed herself instead. The exhibit wasn't that bad." He must have made a joke, but the coldness and delivery left me at a loss for words. I am sure the art did not play a factor, and she did not hang herself. She was murdered in the middle of the day. "I was in my office," he said, giving me an alibi I didn't ask for. That had to mean something. "Did you and Professor Riley spend time together often? I understand you recently broke up. Why would the two of you meet?" He scowled at me. "We were friends. I began working while she was on her last expedition to Greece. When she came to see me, concerned about a cough. Ancient Greece is an area of fascination for me. And it was fine. I wanted to be more than friends, but she didn't. The world is too big to be tied down, she told me." He gnashed his teeth together. "I need to go." "One more question, Dr. DuPont. Do you know Aaron Mulrooney?" "Aaron? Why, yes, she's a nurse at the hospital." His eyes narrowed at me. "Aaron died last week. She suicided, the result of female hysteria." I rose, my gaze never leaving his face. "Is that truly what killed her?" He leaned in uncomfortably close. "You make an accusation against me and I'll have you arrested for defamation." He stormed out without answering the question. I had the thought that Miss Riley was smart not to tie herself to such a volcano of a temper. But I sighed. I needed more information than a well-organized desk and an unrequited suitor could give. I needed another woman. I heard about Elizabeth. Murdered, you say? I just can't believe it. Ann Whiting was an instructor of nursing and the only other woman on Miss Riley's floor. What can I tell you? Well, she invited someone to her home yesterday. I explained the calendar entry. Do you have any idea who it was? Could it have been Dr. DuPont? Most likely her secret lover, Charles Sweeney. Mrs. Whiting laughed. I guess not so secret since I know who he is. He teaches painting at the Cleveland Institute of Art. They met at a concert at Wade Lagoon. He wasn't paying attention and collided with her. He apologized and they began talking. I wondered if he was married, the way they snuck around. They either met at her home or his, but they never went out in public. Don't you think that's odd? Well, it certainly implies something untoward, I said. I understand she recently ended a relationship with Dr. DuPont. Can you tell me about it? A little, she said, leaning forward. A few weeks ago, Dr. DuPont threatened one of the nurses. He was unhappy with her countering his directions regarding a patient and threatened to break her neck if she interfered again. I overheard the entire exchange and stepped in, of course. I reviewed the orders and the nurse was right. He stormed off in a rage as black as night. She shivered at the memory. I told Elizabeth the next day. I knew she found him interesting diversion, but she needed to know what kind of cad she was sleeping with. She broke up with him later that week, but I doubt my story was the reason. It was just the last straw. DuPont's actions didn't surprise me, and I know the man for 10 minutes. Would you happen to know Mrs. Erin Mulrooney? She was a nurse here. Mrs. Whiting froze. I taught Erin. It was her Dr. DuPont threatened. She paused. What do you mean she was a nurse here? All right. H is for hellfire. It was midday, and my stomach was reminding me that I had missed luncheon. But a little hunger was a small price to pay to find Professor Riley's killer, so I forged on to her home. In her desk were the personal letters with far too much information on her mother's gout and her brother's lust for milkmaids. Upstairs, her bedroom was neat, with the exception of her bed, which looked like it had been featured in a tussle. The air was scented with perfume, the one that sat on the dresser. On her bedside table was a book of poetry by Andreas Pappas, her secret admirer. It was inscribed with, "To a woman whose beauty rivals Aphrodite, whose strength exceeds Artemis, and whose intellect is brighter than Apollo's sun." What are you doing? I jumped at the question that was an accusation. Then, recognizing the growl, I turned toward it, grinning. Detective Kelly, whatever are you doing here? You do know breaking and entering is a crime, he said by way of an answer. I smiled modestly, proving I was exactly where I should be. I have a key and an open invitation from the owner to come by any time. He snorted as if he didn't believe me. So now you have a key. You didn't have one yesterday. Right, forgot about that. Hoping to distract, I held up the book. Look what I found. The same man Leona was dating. And that's not all. Professor Riley was secretly seeing an art professor named Charles Sweeney. After examining the book, Kean looked around the room, his gaze resting on the bed. From the looks of it, a good time was had by all. But by who? My cheeks heated as I understood his meaning. Did you learn anything useful about the other murders? He pinned my arm to his side and began walking/dragging me with him. We'll talk about it in the security of your home, Payne. He took my key, locked the door, and kept it. The stubborn man then refused a word on the topic on the drive to my house, talking only about the changing of the trees and the upcoming Halloween festivities. He attempted to be charming but failed. Well, mostly failed. Inside my home smelled like an Italian villa thanks to Maria. Until she joined our family, food was utilitarian, calories to fuel the mind and body. Now, meals were events not to be missed. I held the basket of fresh bread out of Kian's reach. Trade for what you learned from the other detectives. His reach was longer than mine and negated my bargaining power. He tore into the soft bread and then humored me with what he learned. Aaron Mulrooney was ruled to suicide. Luckily, my colleague noted the scene. There were no signs of a shared meal. In the trash were discarded sheets from Hangman games. He interviewed several people about her death. Dr. Michael DuPont was the last person to see her alive and reported her to be upset and unagreeable. Of course she was, I said, and shared what Mrs. Whiting had said about Dr. DuPont and the threat. And she had a secret gentleman, an art professor named Andreas Pappas. His book of poetry was in her bedroom. Not so secret then, Uncle Alistair said. I was able to get several clean fingernail marks off the glass. Bring me samples from DuPont and Pappas and I'll compare them, and I'll be able to tell you which is the killer. Kian nodded, thinking, we can't latch on to the first suspects we come across. I would have you go downtown to compare using the books, but I have a feeling this killer won't be in them. We're looking for a sophisticated killer, I said. No common thug uses silk ropes. Now that Dr. DuPont, I could see him losing his temper and strangling a woman. He has hellfire in his heart. Did Erin lose the last game? Uncle Alistair asked. She did. Kian set down the bread and pulled his notebook from his inside pocket. I looked over his arm as he read. The words from the completed games were Aphrodite, Pumpkin, Athena, and Blue Jay, again with the Greek god theme. The losing word has 6 letters, blank S, blank C, blank E. Failed letters were I, O, A, T, D, and L. Goddesses, not gods. Uncle Alistair repeated the words from Miss Riley and Aaron's game. He seems to run through the goddesses with names beginning with the letter A. Astrea, Electrana, Aphrodite. We already said her. Ete, she's the goddess of mischief and ruin. She would be a good one, but it's only 3 letters. There is no A, Kian said. Both women guessed the letter. Psyche. I looked up at Kian. It has to be her, Psyche. He wrote it out in his notebook. I see why the women couldn't solve it. Odd word. Psyche began life as a beautiful but mortal woman, I said. Aphrodite was jealous and called in Eros, the god of love, to make Psyche fall in love with the ugliest man he could find. The gods didn't think twice about punishing mortals for doing absolutely nothing wrong, so Eros set out to find the bane of Psyche's existence. But Eros wasn't immune to Psyche's charms, and he fell in love with her. He carried her away to a hidden palace, along with her sisters, because he couldn't let Aphrodite see he didn't do the deed. But, for some reason I never understood, he forbade Psyche from looking at him. He would come to his wife at night, be with her, and then leave in the morning. And her sisters teased her about being married to a hideous monster. Why else would he hide himself? So Psyche peeked by the light of a lamp and saw the beautiful god she called husband. He woke and called her out for her betrayal, and he left her. Psyche searched everywhere for her husband, eventually going to Aphrodite. The goddess was delighted to enslave Psyche, challenging her to do impossible tasks, including a descent into the underworld. Eros knew of the trials and secretly kept watch over his wife, helping her without her knowledge. Eventually, Psyche completed all the tasks. She was freed and made immortal, and she and Eros were reunited and lived as happily ever after as the Greek gods can. Oh, she is a part of the Roman gods too, Maria said. Her husband was Cupid, and the angry goddess was Venus, but Psyche was herself. She was a good soul, true to her husband even when he turned his back on her. Father served himself another portion of pasta in a creamy sauce. How does the story of Psyche relate to the murder of 3 women? The room was silent as the 5 of us ate and thought. Perhaps, Maria said tentatively. The game is a challenge. Like Psyche had to endure to win Cupid back, these ladies were tested with the Hangman for their lovers. Maybe, Kian said, if they had lovers. What if they solved the puzzle? Maria shrugged. If they passed the test, they would live, no? Hellfire, Kian muttered under his breath. I was so busy looking for dead women, I never thought to look for living ones. Were there puzzles for Leona? Maria asked. Kian nodded. The room was cleaned, but the pages were in the trash. She didn't seem to understand and lost all the games. For Psyche, she only got the letters P and E. Maria nodded. Leona was a very smart woman, but English is difficult. Playing such a game would be very challenging. An unfair disadvantage, Uncle Alistair said, with surprising vehemence. It is interesting to me that the scenes for the other two crimes were thoroughly cleaned, but not for Professor Riley. Did the other women clean before they were murdered? An interesting question. I thought about how I would entertain such a visitor. I doubt it. Most likely they would have left the plates and cleaned up after their guests left, or, at most, removed the dishes to the kitchen to be cleaned later. And so to Alistair's question, Kian said, the most likely reason Miss Riley's parlor wasn't cleaned is the killer had to leave quickly, as though he were interrupted. He swept the wineglass out of my hand. Tell us everything that happened yesterday. E is for ego, ego, and more ego.
It's Psyche. That's the word.
That's the word.
Yup.
You're not going to get hung today. No hangman. The next day, Kian planned to interview the 3 men whose names had come up in the investigation. It took the threat of following every step for him to decide that I should act as his assistant in my brother's place. I was waiting outside Cleveland Police Headquarters at 7:30 in the morning in my father's carriage, back straight, hat perfectly pitched atop my head. What do you think you're doing? Kian walked down the front steps in a blue suit that complimented his eyes. Not that I noticed. Driving you, I said, as if it wasn't perfectly obvious. Isn't that what assistants do? Not you. He climbed up and took the reins from me. Move over. We'll start with Dr. Michael DuPont. He was the last to see her alive, and he was, quote, friends with Professor Riley. Don't forget he lied to me, I said. He saw Professor Riley that morning, and it wasn't about malaria. He probably threatened to break her neck, too, when she jilted him. Kian chuckled as he snapped the reins. Good thing we're starting with an open mind. Dr. DuPont saw us in a white-tiled room so thick with bleach and camphor that it was difficult to see my notes through my tears. Beside the same metal table my father owned were 2 chairs. I in one, while they stood. There were 2 windows, sealed tightly, stark and without curtains. Yes, I followed Nurse Mulrooney out the door the day she died. She dared contradict my orders for a patient, which is completely unacceptable. Dr. DuPont spoke to Kian, ignoring me. If I threatened to kill her, it was metaphorical. While I understand you think I was the last to see her alive, I assure you I was not, as I did not kill her. Kian leaned into DuPont. It was subtle, but he would have not been intimidated. You were friendly with Professor Riley, and saw her on the morning of her death also. It's interesting that you were acquainted with both women who killed themselves after meeting you. I stayed quiet as Kian led and misled our suspect right into a corner. Oh, wow, I hated the smug doctor for what he did. No, detective, there is nothing interesting about the deaths of 2 women. He glanced at me, a sneer on his lips. I understand from your, assistant that Professor Riley's death is a murder, not suicide. Oops, perhaps I said too much? Kian sighed, a sound of pure annoyance. What did you and Professor Riley talk about the morning of her death? DuPont seethed. His jaw ticked as he huffed like a train. I asked her to marry me. I snorted and then recovered my decorum, to which she smartly said no. He turned his ire on me. She would be alive right now if she had agreed. I jumped from the chair, held back only by Kian's arm. Not if you killed her. I've seen your kind before. If you can't have her, no one can. He pulled back. I can have any woman in Cleveland. I was doing the spinster a favor. Kian covered my mouth. Did you know Miss Leona Petrucci of Mayfield Road? Which was not nearly as interesting as what I was going to say. Petrucci, DuPont repeated. No, he said with a sharp tone, meant to end Kian's questioning. It didn't. Tell me, Doctor, what are your interests outside of work? DuPont cocked his head, thrown for the first time. I prefer intellectual pursuits, lectures, museums, and the sort. He scowled. I frequently enjoy them in the company of intelligent women, but do not make a habit of killing them afterward. What about games? Kian asked. Have you played Hangman? Hangman, he repeated with distaste. What does that have to do with anything? He must have realized how it sounded because he quickly said, No, I've never heard of that one. The only game I fancy involves cards. Do you know who Psyche is? Kian asked. Now DuPont shook his head as if the question were ridiculous. Psyche is the Greek goddess of the soul. If you care to know what she looks like, visit the Institute of Art. There's an excellent painting in the Myths and Legends exhibition that opened last night, which I saw alone. He did it, I said as we climbed back into the carriage. The pompous, arrogant, conceited doctor did it. You know all three of those words mean the same thing. Kian released the brake and urged the horses forward. He was an angry man, to be sure, and you didn't help. It was late morning as Kian and I walked through the gallery in the Cleveland Institute of Art. As DuPont said, there was a newly opened exhibition featuring myths and legends from the corners of the world. My hand on his arm, we looked a proper couple, though one with opposing views. I was excited for the world about to unfold before us. Kian looked like a man resigned to torture. Stop looking as though you're enjoying this, he muttered. We're here for Psyche. I know, I said just as quietly, but it won't hurt to look around. You never know what we could find. We wound silently through the plain walls designed to highlight the works. Some were rather horrid, but others were nice. Perhaps not what I would want hanging in my home, but they belonged, somewhere. We rounded a corner, and there before us was an oil painting of a beautiful woman with butterfly wings. We found Psyche, I said, and then I looked more closely. Kian, the face, that's Professor Riley's face. Kian? He pointed to the adjacent paintings. Aphrodite and Artemis. What are the chances those faces belong to Mrs. Mulrooney and Mrs. Petrucci? It's time to find Professor Charles Sweeney. It was not difficult to find Sweeney's studio. It was difficult to get into it. I'm working, he yelled through the door. My office hours begin at 4 and not 1 minute sooner. Detective Kian Kelly, Cleveland Police. Unlock the door or I'll tear it down. A moment later, the door was opened by a tall, slim, handsome man with splatters of paint on his apron and face. Cleveland Police, what do you want? Kian entered the doorway, eliminating any chance of our being closed out. We've questions for you about Erin Mulrooney. Erin? Oh yes, she was my Artemis. Sweeney stepped back, allowing us to fully enter. She had such a shape, beautiful lines. He glanced at me with interest. I looked away with equal disinterest, taking the opportunity to survey the artist's space. The ceilings were high with one wall of windows. Heavy green and yellow drapes were pushed far to the side, allowing the sunlight to fill the room. In the center was an easel holding a very large canvas. The rest of the space was an organized mess, with canvases stacked on the floor and tables stained with paint. Some appeared wet. What was your relationship with Mrs. Mulrooney? Kian asked. She modeled for me. Where are my sketches? He turned and went to a messy stack of papers. Here she is. He handed one to me proudly. I gasped and passed it to Kian. She's nude. Well, yes, he smiled with amusement. The Greeks were not as sensitive about the human form as we are. Apparently not, Kian said as he made a thorough study of the drawing. Did Leona Petrucci model for you also? Oh, yes, Leona was the perfect Aphrodite. Or maybe I should say Venus, given her nationality. He chuckled at his own joke as he flipped through more pages. I sold the oil just last week, but I should have. Yes, Aphrodite. In this sketch, the goddess in the form of Leona was draped in front of a window. His window. Such perfect skin tone, he said. Kian looked over Sweeney's shoulder at the dozens of pages of sketches. What made Elizabeth Riley perfect for Psyche? Her back, Sweeney said immediately, turning and this time choosing one from the top. Perhaps it came from all of her foraging through forests and jungles for her plants, but I could see Psyche's wings practically bursting free. All of these women are dead, Kian said bluntly. Yes, he said on a long sigh. Beauty lasts but a moment, which is why I must immortalize it. He studied me in earnest. Your lips. You have the energy of Ate. You must sit for me. I would have responded with what he must do, but Kian swept me behind his back. Have you heard of the game of Hangman? Why, yes, he said. My students taught it to me last semester. A simple game, yet it requires strategy. 6 misses is not a lot. Did you play this game with these women? I asked, working to be seen and not just heard. I did many things with my models, and some could be called games. Sweeney smiled, looking the rake. Art demands what it demands. I couldn't contain myself. Who is your Psyche? Sweeney cocked his head, stared at me, a small smile on his lips. I haven't found her yet. Kian pulled me back again. When did you last see Elizabeth Riley? Yesterday, he said. We met to celebrate the unveiling of her painting at the exhibition. She was apprehensive about the exhibition, worried about what it would do to her career. I assured her it could only elevate. Kian raised an eyebrow, a sarcastic one. And what time did you leave her? Sweeney inhaled. I'm not sure. She had students coming over and needed time to prepare. We finished our celebration and I left. I'm afraid there's nothing else I can tell you. Oh, wait, at one point, she thought someone was looking in her dining room window. I investigated but saw no one. Why aren't you arresting him? I demanded as Kian pushed me out of the building. He did it. That's what you said about DuPont, he said, irritatingly rationally. What are you thinking, baiting him? He was practically drooling over you. We found Andrea Pappas in an empty lecture hall. He had 10 minutes to give us before his class began. Leona Petrucci, he spoke quietly on his thick accent. We met in her shop and I had escorted my sister. Leona was a beautiful woman and we became friendly. Her father did not approve. It's hard to say if it was because I am Greek or because I am a soft-handed intellectual. He respected neither and caused many problems. Too many. You could have married her, Kian said. As your wife, her father would have no authority. She had a daughter, he explained. I was not ready to become husband and father. If I had known. Kian watched as Pappas drifted off. You know she died? When Pappas looked to the floor and nodded, Kian followed up. When was the last time you saw her? About 2 weeks before, he said. We met to talk. We reluctantly parted as friends. Do you know a woman named Elizabeth Riley? Pappas frowned but nodded. I collaborated with her on translations of Greek texts. It references to plants dating back to Plato. Even for me, native to Greek and student of Latin, it was slow, tedious work. I went to her home, and she would ply me with food and wine while I pored over the books. A question burst from my too silent lips. Why not work at her office? Pappas looked to Kian as if needing him to stamp my question. The nerve of some men. This is a small world we live in, he said after Kian's nod. She did not want our professional relationship to be misconstrued. Seems to me that meeting in her home would do that more, Kian said. Not less. When did you see her last? Pappas counted on his fingers. Monday. We worked for several hours into the evening. We would have worked later, but the light was lost. Your book was in her bedroom, I blurted out. You compared her to the Greek gods. Elizabeth was a beautiful woman, he said. The poet in me responded to her. What about Erin Mulrooney? Kean asked. She was a nurse. I don't know the name, he said after some thought. I avoid the hospital. It's a place where people go to die, even if you walk in healthy. What do you know of Psyche, Professor? Pappas was surprised. Everything. My specialty is Greek literature. What do you wish to know? Kean paused a minute. What would have happened if Psyche failed Aphrodite's challenges? He crossed his arm as he took time digesting the academic question. She would have died, and Aphrodite would have been justified in taking her life. After all, she failed the challenge. A forfeit was required. I believe I disagree on that point, Kean said, before asking, Are you familiar with the game Hangman? Pappas perked up. Oh, yes, it is a novel game. Why do you ask? He did it, I said, bracing my foot against the carriage so Kean couldn't set me in. Forget what I said about DuPont and Sweeney. Go arrest him. Pappas did it, the cold-hearted monster. I'd like to give him a forfeit. I'm sure you would, Kean said as he shoved me unceremoniously into the passenger seat. Stop thinking with your heart and think with your head. All right, Jack. We're at the deliberation.
Think with your head, man.
Think with your head, man. All right. So Payne needs our help, if she is to think with her head, to help Detective Kean Kelly solve the murders of Elizabeth Riley, Erin Mulrooney, and Leona Petrucci. Here are the suspects who have surfaced. There's only 3. Dr. Michael DuPont, the angry physician. Professor Andreas Pappas, the poet and professor of Greek literature.
Yay.
And Professor Charles Sweeney, the artist and professor who appreciates beauty.
Or something.
Or something. So here are the facts that Kean and Payne have discovered. Elizabeth Riley was killed in her home. She was strangled with a green silk rope. A lost hangman's game was found nearby with the unsolved word Psyche.
Yay.
Miss Riley was acquainted with all 3 suspects. She occasionally attended lectures with DuPont, but turned down his marriage proposal. She hired Professor Pappas to translate Greek text and accepted his book of poetry, and she modeled for Professor Sweeney, who painted her as Psyche.
Cool.
I just realized I wrote a flaw into the story.
What's that?
I had a line in there, and he says, Who's your Psyche? And he says, I haven't found her yet.
You forgot to read that?
I don't know. I just thought of it. I guess he painted her as Psyche.
Oh, that's right. That
So
did
Sweeney,
confuse me in it.
Yeah.
So, is he supposed to have found Psyche?
He did find his Psyche.
You just forgot about that one little line?
I missed it in editing.
Well, another Easter egg in the book, ladies
Another
and gentlemen.
Easter egg in the book.
Go buy it so you can see exactly what we see. It's very important that you do that. I'm kidding.
Okay.
Anyway.
Mrs. Erin Mulrooney died the week before Miss Riley. She had argued with Dr. DuPont when she left work. She had modeled for Professor Sweeney, who'd painted her as Artemis.
Interesting.
Mrs. Leona Petrucci died first. She started seeing Professor Pappas, but they mutually broke it off when her father made trouble. She had modeled for Professor Sweeney, who painted her as Aphrodite, or Venus if you prefer.
All right.
Dr. DuPont was angry with Mulrooney and threatened her. Professor Andreas Pappas, the expert in Greek literature, knows the story of Psyche inside and out. He claimed the breakup with Leona was mutual, and he worked for Miss Riley at her home, by her choice, to avoid rumors of a relationship. Professor Charles Sweeney is a painter who feels his purpose is to immortalize beauty. He admitted knowing all 3 women as they modeled for him. He was probably the last to see Riley alive, having spent time with her celebrating the completion of her painting.
All right.
Sweeney claimed Riley saw someone looking in her dining room window. He did not see anyone.
Okay.
The rope used to hang the women was made of silk, green for Riley, yellow for Petrucci. It was not something any woman had in their home.
Weird.
The killer cleaned up after murdering Mulrooney and Petrucci, but was interrupted by pain at Riley's home.
Okay.
And all three women failed to decipher the hangman game for the Greek goddess Psyche. So, who's about to run out of guesses on his hangman game?
All right. I don't think it's Sweeney because he's who I would pick, but he saw the person out the window. So I believe he's innocent. Either that or one of the other two guys are just weird and he still did do it. But we're going to say no to Sweeney Todd.
Okay, so we're making him red.
Here's the thing. Out of the other two, the obvious one seems to be Big Angry Man.
Yeah.
He claims not to know what Hangman is, but you can just lie about that, especially if you did do what you did. You know, you'd lie and say, no, I don't know what Hangman is. Or you'd just say, yeah, I know it. It's a common game. It's fine. Both approaches were taken here. Andreas Pappas understood all the Latin stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they both did. It was his job, and who was it? Michael? Is that the other guy's name?
Yep.
Michael's hobby. Mikey boy. So the silks did not come from
the women's houses.
The women's houses, and it also didn't come from the Italian woman's, the Roman woman's store, right?
Correct. It was not from her shop.
If it was from her shop, I'd say it was Papa's, because Michael said he didn't know her, right? Who knows?
Correct. He claimed not to know her.
That would have made it real easy. I'd know exactly who to choose.
Mm-hmm.
I would have gamed it. Who knows if that's real or not, but I would have said so. Here's the thing. Pappas said some creepy things in that poem. Right? That was him, right?
I don't remember reading a poem.
There was the book.
Oh, the dedication?
Yeah.
Yes.
Was that?
Yes.
It was a dedication?
It was a dedication.
Man, he got that published quickly then. Either that or he's known them for a while.
I don't know. I didn't think about that part. Maybe he just took one of his ones and just dedicated and just handwritten a dedication and not printed it.
Oh. You wrote it. You should know. Gosh. Who could it be? I'm going to say Andreas Pappas. I can't see right now a connection between what the scarves or the ropes, the silks meant and their colors. You said, do we know what color the last person's was? I thought it was green for one, yellow for another.
Colors were only mentioned for the two, green and yellow.
Okay. Does it matter? Do the colors matter? Just tell me. You won't
Somewhat,
tell me.
Yes.
They do matter. Oh, crap. Well, I got to figure that out. When I think of Artemis, I think of green. Who was the green woman?
I don't know. I have to scroll back up to see. Well, Elizabeth was Psyche. Aaron was Artemis, and Leona was Aphrodite.
And Aaron was the one who didn't have a color, right?
Yes,
they didn't mention
yes.
it. Well, gosh, diddly darn it. So it's not that route.
It must not have been written down.
I really don't know. But if I had to choose a character who would be cognitive enough to use a specific color, I would not give it to Michael. Michael's a smart guy. He's a doctor, don't get me wrong. And he likes the Greek stuff as a hobby. But to me, he's too much of a hothead to do the smart stuff, the smart side of all of that jazz, and not just,
Mm-hmm.
be an angry guy. But maybe that's just me stereotyping angry people in stories. So I'm going to go Pappas.
You're going to go Pappas. Okay,
Yep.
so I'm turning Pappas green.
Turn him green.
Alrighty.
All right, let's nail Pappas with the good old 1800s law.
D is for damnation.
Yay, and Dalmatian.
2 weeks later, I answered the doorbell wearing a dressing gown and a smile. Charles Sweeney was on the other side, his canvas in hand and bag across his shoulder. "Are you nervous?" he asked as he entered. "Anxious is more accurate." I closed the door behind him. "I've sat for you 4 times and you won't let me see what you've done." Anticipation breeds excitement, don't you think? He led the way back to our solarium, having been there before. "Today is our last day." "You sound sad," I said as I followed him. "Don't you think I make a good ate?" He set the easel down and cupped my cheek. "You are perfect. Beauty such as yours should live forever." I laughed as I spun away, going to my perch. 80 years will be enough for me. I shed my robe and donned the length of silk he selected at my first sitting. It was embarrassing how much I enjoyed playing the role of a goddess. My head filled, as it often did, with wondering what Cian Kelly was thinking as he watched from behind the hidden panel. "Just like that," Sweeney said, his eyes darting between me and the canvas, his hand moving with sure, swift movement. "Do not move your lips. That is exactly how Ate looks, full of unrepentant, inexhaustible mischief." Silence ensued as he worked, and I thought, Cian Kelly, I determined, was too much of a gentleman to pursue me the way we both wanted him to. It was my brother's fault, really. If Cian didn't respect Grant, he would have no problem taking me out. Well, Grant wasn't home, which meant I had to work quickly. "Finished!" Sweeney stepped back, radiating satisfaction. I pulled on my dressing gown, noting that over 2 hours had passed. "May I see it now?" He nodded, and I hurried over before he changed his mind. Oh, my. I looked so goddess-like, feminine but strong, wholesome but wicked. "What will you do with it now?" "I'll keep you to myself for a while." He smiled broadly. "Let's celebrate. I brought champagne. We can sip while we play a game." "Wonderful," I said, going to the sideboard for glasses. "These aren't meant for champagne, but I won't tell if you won't." He pulled the bottle from his bag. "There is my ate." He sat up on his couch, filling both glasses. "Have you heard of the game Hangman?" "Of course," I said. "You pick a word and I have to guess it 1 letter at a time. If I misguess 6 times, well, I'm hung." We played, and, well, you can see where this is going. I played my role, celebrating when I succeeded and pouting when he guessed my words. Then he drew out a 6-letter word. I guessed S, which was in the 2nd position, as it should be. Excitement coursed through me. I could hear Cian in my ear telling me to focus. This was not a game. Sweeney was dangerous. I guessed an A, then an E, an I, then a C. "What letter can work with C blank E?" I asked. "N?" "No." Sweeney smiled as he drew a leg. "L," I said confidently. He drew another leg. "You're running out of limbs." "Give me a hint." When Sweeney shook his head, I pretended to study the board. "R." He shook his head and drew an arm. "One last chance, my sweet Ate." "Let me think," I said. "What letter can go before an S?" "O?" Alas, no. He drew the last arm, then sat back against the couch with an oddly satisfied expression. "You will live forever, Payne." I looked away demurely. Who really wants to live forever, Charles? I'd better clean up. My father will be home soon. I rose from the couch and bent to pick up the glasses. Faster than I ever could have believed, silk slid across my throat, tightening to the point of panic. I heard wood snap and I knew Cian was coming. Empowered, I braced my foot on the table and threw my head back into Sweeney's nose. A satisfying crunch followed by a male cry of damnation told me my aim was true. Sweeney was pulled from me, the rope going slack. As I turned, Kian pulled Sweeney over the back of the couch and threw him against the paneling. His fist pounded into the artist's face. "Hit him once for Elizabeth," I shouted, "and again for Aaron and Leona." And Kian did. Such a darling man. I expected Kian to come to the house after he finished arresting Charles Sweeney for the murder of 3 women and the assault on me. Proving men rarely do what you expect them to do, he never showed. At 9 o'clock, I went to the parlor where my father, uncle, and Maria were relaxing. "I'm going out," I announced. My father looked at my costume. "Detective Kelly?" When I nodded, he said, "It will be good to have a detective in the family, even if he is Irish." With that as his blessing, I drove to the rooming house where Kian lived. Unable to use the front door, I went around to the back. Climbing onto a trash can, I reached the fire escape and then made my way to the 3rd floor. I knocked on the window of the darkened room. I repeated myself 3 times before a light came on and his oblivious blonde head appeared. He threw open the window. "Payne, for the love of... what are you doing?" "Calling on you," I said, stating the obvious. I would have come up the front, but there is a sign denying women after 8 p.m. "Get in here." He held my arm as I climbed in the window. "What am I going to do with you?" "Dancing is always a good choice," I suggested. "Carriage rides, and I'm nearly as good at cards as Grant." "Payne," he said as though I didn't know my name. "You're Grant's sister. He wouldn't like it if we, well, got together." "I knew it." I lifted my chin. "Grant has no place between us." "It's not that simple," he erroneously said. "I have a proposition," I said quickly before he could go on. "We'll go together for 9 days. Grant returns in 10. On the night of the last night, we will assess where we are. If we're together, we'll deal with Grant. If apart, he never needs to know." His hand ran through his hair. When he looked at me, I smiled broadly, and he sighed. "Damnation," he said, and I knew I'd won.
Son of a... Okay. It threw me off. I was looking for an easy reason to throw out any particular suspect. He was like, "I saw someone else." I was like, "Great. I don't got to think about him." Gosh.
Well, actually, the separating them was actually pretty simple. I think Sweeney was the only one who knew all 3 victims.
Yeah, I figured that out too. As we were reading, I was like, "Well, hold on. Papas didn't know the nurse.
And DuPont didn't know.
DuPont. I knew DuPont didn't know Fibonacci."
Yeah. Sequence. Yes. And the reason the colors on
It was in the paintings. I realized that.
It was in the paintings, and they came from the cords that were supposed to hold the curtains back in his studio. He had yellow and green curtains that just hung, because that's where he took the strings from.
So where'd he get the last one?
The last one, it just was there's like 4. There's 2 on each side.
Oh, never mind. Never mind me.
But yeah.
Well, darn it. I realize now I should have thought for longer than I did.
So did I meet your standard for using enough of the hangman in the story?
You did. I think it's my biggest pet peeve that I have fallen victim to myself when I accidentally don't use enough of the theme in my story. So like the first one we did, or
Move it or lose it.
Move it or lose it. I just had a guy ran over by a train, and then the
train
didn't matter for the rest. It did not matter for the rest of the story, and I was like, "Oh well, I didn't actually use it." And then, I get a little more critical with other authors, and I'm like, "Well, Jack, you kind of got to shut up because you did the same thing."
I think I did it with.
I'm pretty lenient now.
My story in the first part was on tarot cards.
Yeah.
But I didn't use them like a game tarot. I used them like the magic mystic tarot. And you're like, I'm like, I know.
Yeah. It's nice to hold ourselves to that standard, because then, it becomes fun to play the game of write the story with this requirement. If you come in it with a story in mind already, the requirement's more of a hindrance than it is a fun toy to play with, But if you go into the story knowing you got to write something with a vehicle, or you got to write something, what's this season's theme? Jack, no, don't say it. Games we play.
You left it.
I can't remember themes for the life of me.
But I had to think about the Hangman word. It was weeks to come up with the word psyche, because I was trying to find a word that had an unusual enough arrangement of letters that it wouldn't be often guessed.
The Y is tricky.
And the PS, the starting with the PS.
PS, like pseudonym.
Yeah, and there would have been people, or there would have been women who did know the word psyche who survived this serial killer.
Yeah, in theory. Granted, if you're, posing for a Greek goddess or a Roman goddess, you probably know a little bit about the gods.
Yeah.
But it also means that he's got to watch his mouth. He can't, ever say the goddess's name, or else he'll, give him a hint on accident.
Yeah. So I want to hear something funny.
Of course.
So, I wrote this story. And
yes, you wrote the story.
So I didn't fill out the part on the history or about Hangman.
Do you want to make up our own history? So Hangman started in -12 BC when a guy named got in trouble with his brother Huga, and they decided to grab some old long leaves, twist them together, and yank that guy about yay high off the ground. And then they started chopping off limbs, because what else are you supposed to do? He was hungry. So he started roasting them, and he said, look, I bet if we did this backwards, it'd be a funny word game. And then they learned, then the next step, of course, was to create the alphabet.
Wow.
Uh-huh.
How about I'll finish doing my homework and I'll put it in the show notes.
Well, we can do that too. I like my version better. I don't remember my characters' names, but you can go back and listen to it. They were very fun grunts.
No. So that wraps up this episode of Mysteries to Die For. Support our show by subscribing, telling a mystery lover about us, and giving us a 5-star review. Check out our website, tgwolff.com/podcast, for links to this season's authors. Mysteries to Die For is hosted by TG Wolff and Jack Wolff. The Hangman's Ladies was written by TG Wolff. Music and production are by Jack Wolff. Episode art is by TG Wolff. Join us next week for a toe tag, which is a first chapter from a fresh release in the mystery, crime, or thriller genre. And then come back for our next original story, Rock, Scissors, Paper, Shoot by Jack Wolff.
No.
No?
What's the second word?
Scissors.
No.
No?
No.
What is it?
Rock, paper, scissors.
Rock, scissors, paper.
No, it's not. You're making stuff up.
I make stuff up all the time.
It's totally wrong. Look it up. You will never find rock, scissors, paper. What do you say when you're playing? Rock, scissors, paper, shoot. The more I say it, the more it sounds normal. And it's pissing me off because it's not. And I know it's not. But it's not helping my case.
Just come back in a couple weeks he'll read the story then.
Yep.
All
I'll be
right,
less
Jack.
angry.
Take us out.